Jungle Green. Chapter 1. Space was empty. The Mercurius appeared as its speed dropped below that of laggard light, its black and yellow markings merging with space all around it. 1 minute there was nothing, the next it was there. Ahead of the craft, the star of the Seishu system shone a deep crimson, and the nearest planet, a large gas giant, was lit in shades of orange. Just off the bow, right where the computers had said it would be, the customs post floated, its lights winking, a beacon of humanity in the cold emptiness. Out here at the edge of the spiral arm, the stars were thinly spaced. Looking away from the galactic center was like looking through a black sackcloth. The few visible points of light or blurred shapes indicated other galaxies and the stars that the spiral's gravity struggled to tame. But if you looked the other way, back to the galactic center, the sight would take your breath away, almost blinding you with the concentration of light from 1 trillion stars. If you weren't used to the idea, the sudden arrival of the ship in front of you from nowhere would have seemed miraculous. At over 100 meters long, it was a substantial piece of hardware to appear in such a way, even though it was tiny compared to the emptiness around it. If you hadn't witnessed its arrival, you would have been hard-pressed to pick it out against the star field once it had moved away from that point. In the cockpit, or more appropriately the wheelhouse, since the pilot was not strapped in and was free to move around, there were remarkably few controls considering its abilities. Automation in triplicate kept a much better watch than any human ever could. But there were still some tasks that were left to humans, whether because they did not lend themselves to automation or just to give them something to do was a matter of opinion. And communication was one of them. Whatever the reason, the pilot contacted the authorities on their platform and confirmed all the arrival details. After a brief pause while information was checked and digested, he was given permission to proceed, and the ship accelerated again to a speed just below that of light as it pointed its needle nose towards the 4th planet. In the warmth and safety of the craft, the pilot called back on the intercom to the lounge. "We're just out of Translite, Miss Balcom, and heading in. We should be landing at Seishu Pharma in about 3 hours. I've spoken to customs, and we have clearance." "Thanks, Greg," answered Layla Balcom, her tone distracted. She didn't look up from the pile of papers on the low table and the multiple holoscreens that hovered in midair in front of her. Her stylus scratched rapidly across the paper, the ink a deep, rich blue. It might be old technology now, but she preferred the act of writing with an actual pen to the touchscreens and capacitor-laden transpapers that everyone else embraced. And she hated talking to the machine that could transcribe her words in any sort of style she might desire. Her reluctance marked her out as different in a bland, conforming universe. "Are you okay, Miles?" she asked her companion. Miles Gorham sat opposite her in a leather armchair, reading a file that danced in the air in front of him. Unlike her, he was happy with all the technology and used it exclusively. It was clear from the look on his face, however, that he was not particularly comfortable with space travel. "It's certainly more than a prison transport," he admitted. "And as the years pass, I'm getting more used to traveling this way." To himself, he thought, largely because you can forget you're in a steel and ceramic bubble in all this opulence. "You don't need to hold the ship up with your stomach muscles," she laughed, seeing his tension. She knew all about his past and the not unreasonable fear he had of space travel. On every trip they made, she admired him for the way he forced himself to overcome it, just to be with her. Miles had spent time in an orbiting prison, framed for a crime he hadn't committed, and had nearly died on his release when the automated shuttle bringing him back to freedom had depressurized on re-entry. He had woken her in the night more than once, sweating and thrashing, shouting about useless masks and fighting people. He had told her his biggest fear was that even though he had been exonerated, he would die on his way to freedom. Since then, any activity that involved leaving solid ground and ample atmosphere had worried him. Layla knew the reasons for his imprisonment, and it made her love him all the more. Even though she hadn't known him at the time, it had been because of her that he had been put in that position. She knew that what remained of this flight, the re-entry and the landing, would be smooth and would feel little different to interplanetary flight, or sitting on the ground, come to that. Mercurius, Balcom's finest and latest design, had inertial dampers and all the distractions to take away any unpleasantness. In fact, if Greg hadn't called so publicly, Miles would have been none the wiser until the door opened at their destination. But Layla wanted to know, and she was the boss.
"I realize that you didn't want to come on this trip," she said. "I know I had to promise you a holiday to get you here."
"But I didn't want to be apart from you for months either," he replied. "Because I know what happens once you get started." And he had been right. Somehow the holiday had already changed into a tour of the major Balcom factories and facilities in this part of the galaxy, with a bit of very light sightseeing thrown in, almost as an afterthought. It had not been an easy few months. Igor Balcom, Layla's father and the driving force behind Balcom Industrial for so long, had finally succumbed to the illness that had plagued his final years. Miles knew that there were suspicions that he had been slowly poisoned. The prime suspect was his ex-personal assistant, Donna Marks. Since her departure from the scene, Igor had certainly been better, but the damage to his health had been severe, and he had never really recovered. Donna had tried to take over Balcom and had almost succeeded. She had infiltrated her loyalists all through the company, and it had taken a lot of work by high-priced lawyers to weed them out and undo the havoc they had caused. But now Layla was secure and in charge. As an ex-journalist and the company's new press officer, Miles knew that there had been enough intrigue there for anyone to cope with, and several of Donna's entourage, including her sister, were presently languishing in the prison that Miles had once been in. That made him smile. As for the idea that this trip was going to be some sort of holiday for them, there was far too much to do running Balcom for Layla to ever be off duty. Layla pushed the papers away and stood up. Pushing her hair back from her forehead, she crossed to stand behind Miles, walking straight through the holoscreens. She rubbed his shoulders, feeling the knots of muscle under her fingers. He put his hands on hers and looked up into her eyes. "Thanks, darling. I needed that."
"And I know that I really do need a break," she said, continuing her massage. "Just a quick look around the factory to introduce myself, and then we can escape for a whole week, sitting on the beach under the sun, a cool drink and forgetting all about work. I promise."
Miles cast his mind back to their last stop, the mines on Besant. That was supposed to have been a quick meet and greet and then a break on safari, searching out the wild and elusive herbivores that the unspoilt plains were famous for. It had all been arranged, and he, for one, had been looking forward to it. But to his frustration, they had spent the whole time justifying new mining operations and answering mostly frivolous objections from conservationists. Layla was committed to doing as much as she could to protect the environment of the planet, yet it hardly seemed to matter to the objectors. No matter what she offered, it was never enough. There was always another problem that required concessions. Negotiations had dragged on, and Miles saw his break disappearing with every new demand. In the end, instead of the safari in vehicles, sleeping under the stars and getting close to the animals, they managed a mere half-day flight over the plains, barely catching a glimpse of the beasts as they fled from the noise of their passing. The problem was, Miles knew, that she was too serious about being in charge. Now she had regained her position in Balcom, she was determined to be seen as the boss and was unable to leave running the company to others. This tour was turning more into an exercise in reassuring the local managers that she was in charge, and that it was business as usual. Miles and Layla were a properly married couple. That was another anachronism that marked the couple out as different from the rest of society. He had insisted that he keep up his role as Balcom's press officer, despite the fact that he didn't need to work. The truth was that he was a journalist and couldn't stop if he wanted, and it deflected any suggestion that he had married the boss for an easy life. Balcom's press operation was as complex as any job he had done in the past, and in many ways his role in the company was as important as hers. But unlike her, he was able to push it all to one side when the occasion demanded. And after the last few hectic months, it was definitely time for a break. "Where have I heard that before?" he asked.
"Well, I mean it this time,"
she said, a little too quickly, her tone betraying her. "Why are we really here?" he asked. She looked innocent.
"Just to show my face and have a holiday."
"I don't buy it," he answered. "Don't forget, I see all the press and have to deal with it. Of all the company facilities we could visit, we end up here at Seishu Pharma. And just after the big story in the news about the counterfeit drugs factory found on Hendar, making copies of Seishu Pharma drugs," she pouted, stopped her massage abruptly, and returned to her seat.
"Okay, you got me. And since you seem to know, what are your thoughts?"
Miles took a drink of water and carried on, oblivious to her show of annoyance. It was a trick she used to throw people off guard. "The fact is," he said, "that counterfeiting has always been a part of the drugs business, but the problem is definitely increasing. Seishu Pharma produces the 3 best-selling drugs in the sector, but the most important one of them all is TC. It's the only thing that makes one world inhabitable, and even though our factory here is apparently secure, and no counterfeit TC was found on Hendar, you're worried at the article's suggestion that someone might be copying it."
"That's right, darling. The trouble is, we just don't know," she nodded. "We expect a certain amount of counterfeit drugs. It's factored into our costings, so we can take the hit. And we know that some of our products have always been copied. But TC is different. It's our only weapon against Fargus swamp fever. Confidence in it is important to our reputation, and if it's being copied, I want to know how."
"I do know about TC," Miles said. "I've read the sales literature and the company reports," she smiled. Of course he had. He took his job seriously. She continued.
"If a copy of something else doesn't work, well, there are generally other drugs, but TC is much more important than that. It's all we have. There is no alternative. People need to know they are taking a genuine product that's pure, not some dubious ripoff."